Will China intervene to stop protests in Hong Kong? Beijing warns protesters, saying its patience is wearing thin after many weeks of chaos. But what options does it have to deal with anger in Hong Kong? And is a military intervention possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. China has warned it might be losing patience with what it calls a color revolution in Hong Kong. It said those who play with fire must not mistake Beijing's restraint for weakness. They will eventually be punished. A few days after that warning, protesters were back on the streets for the 10th straight weekend. They've defied a police ban on some of the marches and again faced tear gas. Activists have also staged a protest at the international airport to make arriving tourists aware of their campaign. Protesters want Chief Executive Leader Carrie Lam to resign, greater democratic reform, and an inquiry into alleged police violence. But Lam says her priority is to stop the unrest that she says has hurt the city's economy. Al-Jazeera's Rob McBride has been covering the protests.
Another day of protests on the streets of Hong Kong and, predictably perhaps, once more ending in violent clashes with the police. This march that we were following started in a district called Sham Shui Po. That's a part of the Kowloon area of Hong Kong, where thousands of people took part. Even though it was technically an illegal demonstration, it didn't put people off, given the strength of feeling that exists here in Hong Kong at the moment. Once they reached the end of the march, most people simply went home, but a hardcore pressed on and tried to storm Chung Sha Wan police station, which is just a couple of hundred meters down this road here. They formed a barricade, they pushed try to get within throwing range of the walls, with police very much barricaded inside. Predictably, a clash broke out. Police fired tear gas and also rubber bullets, dispersing the people, who then slipped away. It's part of the protesters' tactics of hit and run. And then very quickly, squads of riot police arrived to very much place their authority once more on the streets of Hong Kong. It does seem to be perhaps a more robust response from the police here. Watching very closely, of course, will be Beijing, and they would applaud such a tough move. They would applaud taking a tougher stance with these demonstrators that we've probably seen today. As we know from remarks that the Chinese central government has made, Hong Kong very quickly is almost reaching a point of no return, is almost on a knife edge, as people here have said, that this whole system of one country, two systems is possibly in danger of collapse, which could, of course, mean eventually having to declare a state of emergency and sending in the People's Liberation Army. We are nowhere near that at this stage, but China is watching very carefully. Rob McBride for Inside Story.
This is what the director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, Zhang Xiaoming, who is a top Chinese official, had to say on Wednesday. The violence is getting more and more intense, impacting an increasingly wide part of the society. It can be said that Hong Kong is facing the most serious situation since its return to China. The movement about the extradition bill has gone bad, and it has the clear characteristics of a color revolution. If the situation in Hong Kong continues to worsen into unrest that the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region government cannot control, the central government will not sit back and do nothing. All right, let's bring in our guests from Hong Kong via Skype. Tom Grundy is editor-in-chief and founder of Hong Kong Free Press, an independent publication. From Beijing, Einar Tangen is China political analyst and advises the Chinese government on economic issues and development. And finally, from Nottingham via Skype, Steve Tsang is director of the China Institute at SOAS University of London. Welcome to the program. Steve, let me start with you. The protests have been evolving. What have you noticed changing in the past week?
Well, the really big development in the last week was the language the Chinese government is using. It is now describing the events in Hong Kong as close to that of a color revolution. Now, that's a very, very important change in language that reflects something very important. To the Chinese Communist Party, color revolutions are ultimately about unseating the party from power in China. And that is something which the party or Xi Jinping absolutely will not tolerate. That is, I think, the single most important development in the last week.
Einar, what does it mean to you in Beijing that China is using this kind of language, that they're describing it as a color revolution?
Well, I think you should look at it as a reaction to what's happening in Hong Kong. I mean, this has morphed from the kind of political theater that somehow this extradition treaty was unfair to Hong Kong to a full-blown cry for a complete democratic system. Universal suffrage. I mean, in essence, this is a direct challenge to the existing basic laws and also to Beijing. So I think they're reacting to that, and they will continue to react if these kind of fringe elements continue to push this idea.
Tom, we've talked about the demands that protesters have put out there. We're talking about a complete withdrawal of this extradition bill, an independent inquiry into the crisis, an investigation into what they say is an excessive use of force by police, and also for Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, to step down. If one or two of these demands are met, would that put an end to the protests?
I'm sure that Hong Kong could not make any such concessions because it would mean that protests work. But unlike what Mr. Tsang was just saying there, universal suffrage is actually something baked into the mini constitution here, the basic law. One of the articles says, I have it right here, that the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage. So this idea of a color revolution, people are not fighting for something new. From what we've been seeing and who we've been speaking to on the streets, they're defending the freedoms and the civil liberties that were promised to them anyway. In many ways, with the demands that you have listed there, they are conservatives because they simply want the freedoms that were promised in the basic law and the one country, two systems agreement to be maintained.
Einar, it looked like you wanted to jump in, so I'm gonna let you have your reaction. But also, I want to ask you about a development that's come about in the past couple of days, where communist-backed publications are essentially accusing the U.S. of being involved in these protests. What kind of direction does this move all of this into?
Well, quite frankly, from Beijing's point of view, the meetings by senior Democratic Party founder, Mr. Liu, going to Washington, meeting with Pompeo, with Pence, and also Bolton, and in addition to Congress, and seeking support for an independent democratic Hong Kong. And then this latest meeting between a senior embassy official and Mr. Wang, the student leader, has made it very clear, at least in Beijing's eyes, that the U.S. is supporting this particular action. And they believe it's part of a kind of all-pressure situation that, in addition to the trade issue, in addition to sending ships through the Taiwan Straits, that this is another tactic and that the U.S. doesn't care what happens to Hong Kong, only if they can use this as a pawn in a game to gain economic advantage.
Steve, it looked like you were reacting to some of what Einar had to say there, so I want to see if you want to jump in. And I also want to ask you, what do you think about these accusations by China or by communist-backed publications that are essentially alleging that the U.S. is also involved, that there are foreign influences involved in these protests as well?
Well, if I were the director of the CIA, I would be very pleased with what the Chinese government was saying, because it would say that the CIA is delivering miracles that the CIA is totally and utterly incapable of delivering. I think all these allegations of American and other foreign interference are completely groundless. There is a protest that is very much developing out of Hong Kong because of the way how both the Special Administrative Region government and the Chinese government have been dealing with people in Hong Kong. But having said that, I think we do have to take the Chinese government's, albeit mistaken view of foreign intervention seriously. We have to be aware that policies are never made on the basis of reality, but on the basis of one's perceptions and analysis of the reality. They see a lot of shadows behind Hong Kong, black hands in their language, when there really isn't any black hand. And this is a very important issue because it means that the Chinese government is not understanding where the problem really lies in Hong Kong. In a mirror situation, the protesters in Hong Kong are also not seeing what the Chinese government may actually do in response to what they are doing, even though they are not pushing for full-scale democracy at this stage. Their demands are still very much focused on the issue of the laws that have to be withdrawn, that the protesters who are arrested should be free, and a judge-led inquiry should be instituted. They are not really the kind of things that Chinese government are saying about a color revolution. But if Beijing sees it, they have a problem. Both sides need to understand each other in order to find a way out. At the moment, we are not seeing that happening.
Tom, having listened to what Steve just said, do you believe that Beijing, no matter what their rhetoric might be, no matter what moves they've made, do you believe that Beijing really understands what lies at the heart of these protests and these demands from protesters?
Well, I don't think it's coming from abroad. I think those theories are wacky at best and wildly conspiratorial at worst. Looking at some of the videos and things put out by state media, it's quite comical. There is just no evidence for it. Meetings with officials by consulates and others abroad are pretty normal, including meeting those of the opposition. I've seen videos of Caucasians who are present at these protests, and we know a lot of them as journalists or local residents. And most comically, we've seen local lawmakers point to some of the gear protesters are using, like wok lids or swimming floats or laser pens and gas masks. These things are available freely. Here, I don't think the CIA has much of a budget if that's what they're furnishing the protesters with. The fact is, this is an organic, homegrown movement that has come out of years of frustration whereby peaceful protests have not worked, through decades of demands for universal suffrage. And to suggest that it's coming from elsewhere is kind of Orientalist, to suggest that people cannot have independent thought here or organize themselves or purchase face masks without the help of foreigners.
Einar, we're hearing more and more warnings from China, and it seems to be indicating that Beijing's patience is wearing ever thinner. So what exactly is China prepared to do if these protests don't diminish?
Well, that's a very large question. I mean, there's a legal way to do that, in which case it would be the Hong Kong government would request under the basic laws that this situation had become civil strife and that they could have the PLA actually come in and take control of the situation. That would be an invitation. The other way is if China thought that a foreign power was behind these attacks and was financing them. Now, both my fellow guests have said, oh, this is nonsense. But they didn't refute the fact that there were meetings between the pro-democracy side and high-level officials of Bolton, Pence, and Pompeo, and the leader of the House, Pelosi, who all encouraged this and said that Hong Kong should pursue a democratic future. So in this particular case, it doesn't make sense for them to just say poo-poo, this doesn't exist, it's all imaginary. Now, also, you start looking at how organized these protests are, how they're morphing their strategies. They're doing this hit and run, as your lead-in indicated. This is not the kind of sophistication that you would expect from students, nor it's fine to say that you can buy these things, but the fact is, if you go to these sites, they will give you a helmet, they will give you a gas mask, they will give you other things, signages, all of it are all freshly printed. This takes a lot of logistics, coordination, getting all these people things. Now, there are two
via
separate
telegram and
issues
the internet.
here. One are the legal demonstrations, which are fine, like at the airport. Excuse me?
Tom, go ahead. Einar's asking you what you said.
We know exactly how the protesters are organizing themselves and acquiring this gear. They are buying it from shops from the internet. You can see it freely happening. It's out in the open, on Telegram, on social media. Unlike the mainland, where there is censorship, the free internet here has enabled people to do that. Do you not feel that local people are capable of making such purchases?
No, I don't feel that they're capable of making these purchases in the amount they have. Remember, this is a group of people who are protesting, in essence, against the unfairness of the system. You have a country that has the 8th largest GDP per person in the world, and it's one of the richest. It's done very well with its trade as an open door to both sides into China and outside of China. Yet the masses of people and these young people cannot even think of affording a basic house. Their wages are basically stagnant in a country where they're forced to compete against very wealthy expatriates who are coming in. So the underlying issue here is the economic unfairness. And you talk about this as if they have lots of extra money to spend on such frivolities as gas masks, hard helmets, and signage. It has to be coordinated. They're not buying them themselves and giving them out at these protests.
Gentlemen,
we can see plainly on the things that they're doing that.
Let me just stop you there. I'll give you, Tom, in a minute a chance to respond, because I want to get to Steve, because Steve, I saw you shaking your head, so I want to see what your response is to what Einar was saying, but also I want to focus on one point he was making. He was saying that perhaps there would be a scenario or a legal mechanism by which Hong Kong would request that the People's Liberation Army come to Hong Kong to deal with these protests. And so what I want to ask you is, do you think that there is any chance that the PLA would at some point in the near or long-term future show up on the streets of Hong Kong?
In a word, yes. Now, we are not seeing the PLA being deployed in the immediate future. I don't see that. I think we are still quite some way away. There are other options that are still available to the Chinese government. But if it comes to it, and if Xi Jinping or the Chinese government feels that the authority of the Chinese Communist Party in Hong Kong, and which is part of the PRC, is being challenged, they will do whatever it takes. If it means sending in the PLA or calling out the PLA garrison in Hong Kong, they will do that. I don't think we should have any illusions about that. Now, having said that, I think the earlier conversation was really a bit rather unreal. We have to deal with realities. There's no point in making allegations which are totally ungrounded in reality. People in Hong Kong are perfectly capable of organizing themselves. People who say they don't simply don't understand how Hong Kong society operates. And the young people in Hong Kong may not have a lot of money. They are perfectly capable of prioritizing what they believe to be important. They believe what they are protesting today is the last chance for them to defend their core values. And if people think that for something as important as this for people in Hong Kong, and they would prioritize the career rather than their spending the money to buy the hard hats and gas masks, I don't think they really understand what's actually going on. I mean, most of the demonstrators in Hong Kong, the more activist ones, are either graduates or university students. They have a good future, economic future in Hong Kong. They are not out there for personal gains. They are out there for what they believe in. I think Beijing needs to understand that if we are going to find a way to avoid a train crash in Hong Kong.
Tom, I know you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to let you do that now, but I also want to ask you, is what's going on now proof to you and many others that China's one country, two systems model is no longer viable?
Well, yeah, I wanted to respond to Mr. Tang in that he's expertly towing the Beijing's line there by trying to refocus this on economic issues and the plight of young people, which exist. But that doesn't mean that they can't purchase, face masks and things. It's rather insulting to suggest that they can't. It's quite an educated and middle class, society. A lot of people live with their parents and they can afford a few dollars to buy a wok lid to cover tear gas as it's shot at them. A lot of these items are donated, and we've seen fundraising campaigns online in the millions of dollars to support them, because there is a decent level of support locally for what's going on. As for the second part of your question, one country, two systems is the big concern. I think for these young people are going to be alive when this agreement is set to expire in 2047 and we go into the unknown. That's why they're protesting for their future. Many of them don't have, a second option or elsewhere to live. But when it comes to PLA involvement, which you've also suggested, I think that is also, way far off into the future, because there are other, toys that the police can bring out, such as water cannon. And we've really seen a bit of a crackdown the last week or two, with police being more forthright in making arrests for unlawful assembly. But it's true to say this does bring a big question mark over one country, two systems. And certainly if there was PLA involvement, that would be admitting that agreement for Hong Kong's autonomy is dead.
Einar, let me ask you specifically about Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam. Where do things stand between Carrie Lam and Beijing right now? And is there any chance at some point soon she loses the support of Beijing and has to step aside?
Well, realistically, I think she lost the support through the handling of this matter. It was her idea to push this particular extradition treaty at the time. She thought it would be a very sympathetic cause because of the murder of this young woman and her child by a Hong Kong citizen after he took her to Taiwan, or at least alleged that this is what happened. And I think, but Beijing is not going to abandon her. They do not want to be seen to be giving in to a mob rule. I'm actually kind of appalled by both of my fellow commentators that they don't seem to have any kind of sympathy for the people of Hong Kong who are being not only inconvenienced, but actually physically harmed by this. You know, the police officers who've been attacked and wounded, lost fingers, the woman at the subway station who was pregnant and could not get to the hospital. You know, this is not about attacking mainland China. You know, what these students, these radical elements, I'm not referring to the whole movement, the ones that are illegal, are going after their own. They're setting fires in front of police stations. They're defacing public property. You saw what kind of hoodlism they engaged in at the main house of government. This is kind of things. They're blocking tunnels. I mean, how is this helping, preventing people from getting to work? Is this the way? Is this the face of democracy? Is this how you protect the rule of law, by breaking it, by not only inconveniencing, but harming your fellow citizens? What's the response to this? Is this somehow all part of the cost of pushing this kind of color revolution?
Tom, I'm going to give you the last word here, but just beware, we don't have a lot of time. We only have about a minute left. I want to ask you to respond to what Einar was saying, and also from your vantage point there in Hong Kong and having been on the streets there, what about the specific charge of danger to residents and people being caught up in the violence when it happens?
Just to respond with Carrie Lam, I mean, I tend to agree Beijing is going to stick by her. At least for now. Maybe in a few months we will see her stepping down for family reasons or something like that. But this demand that's been brought up a couple of times during this show of her to be, for her to step down, we've not heard that on the streets for a while. I think protesters would prefer a lame duck in place. So that demand has been replaced with implementation of universal suffrage. But if Mr. Tang was thinking I'm ready to defend protesters and some of the violent actions we've seen on their side, bearing in mind, you know, I've seen hairy scenes coming from both sides, then I'm not going to. I've seen them besiege the police station just at the bottom of my building using bricks and slingshots, and I've seen tear gas canisters in their hundreds thrown in pretty indiscriminately against the people outside, including residents and tourists in the heart of the tourist district. And as I left to do this show, the anger on the street was coming from residents, and they had a few choice words and profanity for the police, because whenever we speak to people, and we've no horse in this, we find that there is still a decent level of support from the residents, despite it being a tear gas buffet across the city for the protesters.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there because we have run out of time. Thank you to all our guests, Tom Grundy, Einar Tangen, and Steve Tsang. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.